One thing that I wanted to talk about today was exposure and how exposure work. If we look at those items that your text talks about, it's a little gray at some point in time, and exposure is essentially what makes a camera, what makes a photo work out well or look good. The one thing to think about is that whenever you're doing something photographically, you've got a combination of an aperture and a shutter speed, and those two things together deliver the image. And this is where it gets a little difficult. The things I try and talk about with this should work, depending if you're shooting with a just generic point and shoot, or if you've got a DSLR type camera. These principles work, and they even go if you've got a Russian spy camera. It's the same thing, and they all work out that same way. But the things to think about are shutter speed and aperture. All right, and that's really gray, especially if you're on a point and shoot, because you don't know, or a lot of times don't have total control over what those things do. In course documents, there's a sheet that talks about equivalent exposures, and what you do is you take that sheet and you cut it into the two different discs that are there, one that has shutter speed and one that has your f-stops, and you put it together, and you can see that if you match something up, like if we look at f5.6 at 1/60th of a second, we can see that there's a number of equivalent exposures that work around. That'll give you the same shot. It'll give you the same exposure. The difference comes from that aperture and shutter speed combination, and it's the distinct differences between those two that make the exposures different. Aperture, the opening of the camera lens, that controls your depth of field, and your shutter speed is how long the shutter stays open. That controls motion. So if you've got something moving, if you've got a really fast shutter speed, it'll stop that action, whereas if you've got a really long shutter speed and something's moving, it'll blur. And with those things, looking at that, things moving towards you tend to blur less. Things that are moving across the film plane have a greater chance of blurring. And when you're looking at like a point and shoot, it's a little bit more difficult, because with the DSLRs, you have the ability to set aperture and shutter speed manually. So you can do any kind of combination that you want. But if you look at the point and shoot, you're like, well, how do I do that? And one thing that I always talk about in the photography class is to take advantage of what you do have and go through and look at what's there. I've got kind of a print off here just so you can see. Every camera has some sort of camera mode, where you've got some close-up or landscape or night portrait. There's a million of them. Some cameras have, kids and pets and I don't know, ice cream, whatever the setting is. But you can go through and take advantage of those, because those settings, you'll have to go through your manual and see exactly what all you have. Those settings modify your aperture and shutter speed. All right, so if you look at something like a portrait setting, pretty much everyone has a portrait setting. The thing that you're going to have there is you're going to have a big aperture, because you want a really shallow depth of field, because if you're taking a picture of somebody, you don't want all the junk in the background to be in focus as well. You want all the emphasis on the face. So a real wide aperture, which will be a small number like an f2.8, f4, is going to have a really short depth of field. So that means everything in the background will be blurry, the person will be nice and focused. Some other things we'll talk about later on that change that as well, but just generally as a general rule, that's a good place to start with that. So those are really good ways to start and work right now with this. One thing I want you to also think about as you're taking pictures here is we should look at some sort of constant. The thing that I normally have is to have people drop their ISO to 200 and make sure that you're forcing your ISO on 200. It's just another exposure variable that maybe doesn't work and it gets confusing. You know, what's the difference between ISO 400 and 60 or 300 or 1800? And basically they go back to film speeds. You know, it used to be able to go by film, you know, it'd be 200 speed film, 400 speed film. That's how sensitive the film is to light transmission. So the higher the number, the more sensitive it is. And if you take everything that you shoot this term and just put it at ISO 200, and you'll have to go through each camera mode and adjust it from there as well, because they will sometimes overwrite each one, and sometimes you won't be able to change it. You're just stuck at ISO 800, and that's what that camera mode has. But you can go through and set it at 200. That way, if you go through the term and you look at all your photos, you can say, oh, okay, this happened here. This was this setting, and this was that setting, and I can see how those two made a difference. But with your modes, try and look at these. I know hopefully, you know, you're gonna have to get out of shooting in automatic mode. You know, automatic mode in terms of how the camera meters, in terms of how the settings are put together. You meter in automatic mode, and this is what your camera shoots for, right there, gray, 18% gray. So if you've ever shot like snow, you know, nice picture outdoors, nice snowy, first snow of the year kind of thing, you know, you got the puppy or the kid out in the yard, and it's all gray. It's because you got so much white. You know, there's so much white out there that the camera's trying to get your exposure to 18% gray. So overall, it's looking for 18% gray, which means everything that's in there is going to go to that extreme. So if you've got a lot of white, it's going to be really washed out and gray. If you've got a lot of dark, it's going to be real muddy as well, because it's trying to make that dark stuff a lot lighter. And when you're shooting in automatic mode, I kind of tend to say that you get an average exposure. You know, it's looking for an average of that 18% gray. So, you know, average meter equals average exposure, which in turn then equals average photo. You know, you're not going to get anything really thrilling. You're not going to get anything really exciting with 18% gray. It's kind of dull, boring, right? So going through and looking at your camera modes and settings and modifying those will help change. And you've got them with the DSLRs as well, but you've got the modes as well on here that you can change, you know, aperture and shutter speed. Go through and just find something to take a picture of, and take a picture of it in every single mode, and see what that does. And you can see the difference. Sometimes it'll be hard to handhold your camera because, you know, it's gonna have a really, really long shutter speed. Like if you get like a fireworks mode or something like that, that's a long shutter speed to get that blurry kind of look that you see with fireworks, where you've got the big kind of hanging thing from the fireworks instead of just trying to freeze the action with those. So go through it and try that and see. Generally, when you look at camera modes, fireworks mode, nighttime portrait, those are going to have long shutter speeds. And if you look at like a portrait mode, that's going to have a really big aperture, so it's going to have a real shallow depth of field. If you look at like a sports mode, most people have one of those, it's going to be a really fast shutter speed, so that you can freeze the action. Generally, there's other things that happen with those too in terms of focus and whatnot, but if you think about that, you can kind of break that habit. One of the hardest things that people tend to do is not use any of those modes anywhere else. You know, you're outside somewhere and it's like, well, there's no fireworks. I can't use fireworks mode outside. Sure you can. Why not? You know, it's just, you don't have to be stuck with that. You know, use portrait mode when you're out with your friends at the bar. Use landscape mode. Use fireworks mode. Anything like that. And you can see how that can change your photos. You don't have to be in that situation. You don't have to be at a museum to use museum mode. But go through and play with those and see how they affect your exposure. And I think that's going to be the biggest thing there. If you've got a manual control camera, this will be your saving grace for a while. You can go through and see, it'll tell you how to set cameras. It gets really difficult now because cameras don't have the standard kind of modes that they did before. So find out, meter what it would say, and then go to manual mode in a DSLR and plug in all these other guys and see what happens there. Let me know how this worked out.